Ohayou gozaimasu, and welcome to another short take on Kurosawa Kiyoshi. This time in a much more recent short film, one made in and released in 2024 in Japan, but which is only just starting to find its way into the West. And just this week, I've actually been seeing notices, reviews and things about this film, largely that have been indexed to the release and comparative success of Cloud. So given that it's my work on Cloud that has kind of facilitated this, that seems logical and interesting. And I think, as I said when I engaged in Cloud, in thinking about and speaking about Cloud, this film, and to my mind Chime as well, represent Kurosawa kind of looking back somewhat after one or two films that have in various ways seen him treading new path, or new paths. In fact, another recent film which is yet to be released widely is actually a remake of an old film of his, the film Serpent's Path, which he remade 2 years ago in France, and that's a film that hasn't been widely released yet. So to a certain extent, Kurosawa is looking back in his career as much as, if not more than, he is looking forward. And Chime is the kind of horror film made in the mode and with the same style that characterized the films that by and large made his name, both internationally and indeed in Japan. Films like Cure, Cairo, Seance, Loft, Retribution and what have you. Chime very much looks back to these films in all kinds of ways. So I think, beside Cloud and in anticipation of the release of the remake of Serpent's Path, I think engaging with Chime now is very topical and very fruitful at this moment. So let's do that without any further ado. Okay then, Chime is centered around the figure of Matsuoka-san, Mr. Matsuoka, who is in the process of interviewing for a job as a head chef at a French restaurant or bistro, and is at the same time teaching classes on cooking. One of his students in said classes is a strange man who says odd things about being able to hear noises. And it's not really a spoiler because it happens fairly early in the film. But if you want to go into this completely fresh, then turn off now. In one lesson, this young student says that he had only joined, or he has only joined Matsuoka-san's cooking lessons in order to try and take his mind off the babbling and the noises, the chimes of the title that he's constantly hearing, and which are beginning to be manifest in sort of voices. In one class, he says that he has had half of his brain removed and it's been replaced with like mechanical equipment or something. Following which he tells Matsuoka-san that he will prove this to him, and in front of the sort of horrified teacher and fellow students proceeds to stab himself in the neck and kill himself. In the wake of this, Matsuoka-san begins himself to behave in quite a strange way. And indeed, again, spoilers, you've been warned. He ultimately goes on to murder one of his students by stabbing her, and seems himself to be beset with this kind of internal malaise. It also appears a little bit like the M. Night Shyamalan film, The Happening, though I'm loath to put that sort of horrific film, not good horrific, in the same context as this one. But this sense of completely random acts of violence that seem to be being carried out by disturbed people who otherwise don't appear to be disturbed is also made manifest when a man in a restaurant, in a cafe, out of the blue tries to murder a woman, tries to stab a woman at a nearby table. So there seems to be, as it were, something in the air. Ultimately, there are sort of domestic tensions. Matsuoka's wife seems at times almost catatonic. She has a propensity for kind of mechanically collecting and then placing in recycling empty cans. And she seems to sort of almost get lost in this act to the extent that she becomes completely sort of vacant. She glazes over as though she's in some kind of a hypnotic trance. While Matsuoka's son, who is an adolescent, a young teenager, he looks like, he begins to almost taunt his dad with his own sort of insouciance and his own kind of quasi rebelliousness, if you like. And the point of this film, the line of interest, I think, or one of the lines of interest, is the extent to which this is to be taken at face value, literally, or whether this is some kind of subjective malaise that we're seeing being made manifest. I think the fact that the film ultimately, for the final sort of 10 minutes or so, the film's around 45 minutes in length. The fact that it ultimately centers in and around Matsuoka-san's house suggests that domesticity is kind of a key referent here, and domestic familial relations. Now, I think Kurosawa has sporadically been very much given to exploring and working through marital and familial tensions. Obviously, Tokyo Sonata is the most obvious example here. But I think recently, as I said in my review of Cloud, that film kind of ruminates, potentially metaphorically, on a relationship, on a prospective marriage, and the domestic situations inherent in that. And I think Wife of a Spy, for those of you who've seen Wife of a Spy, I think the crux of that film, the heart of that film, is its exploration of a marriage, and what the characters, the wife of the title and her husband, what they embark upon in that film, I think comes ultimately down to an exploration of marital discord, a search for marital harmony. And I think so it is here. And obviously Matsuoka-san's domestic situation, the fact that his wife seems all but unresponsive, she seems to just go through the motions of being a wife and a housewife. She seems to behave in a very vacant way, as though she's just completely checked out mentally and is just sort of physically, kind of robotically, almost by rote, just doing what she needs to do as a wife. And the fact that his son is sort of testing the waters, if you like, of what he can get away with, what he can ask for, and generally just behaving like a teenager, you know, someone just embarking on puberty, and the, especially in boys, the sort of seismic changes that this tends to entail. The fact that this is the case suggests that the horrors may be figurative, that this may be a sort of horrific extrapolation of quite quotidian tensions and sort of domestic discord, something that perhaps has been left to rumble or to sound like the chimes of the title, maybe, and that the characters have been, you know, ignoring or marginalizing as they, you know, go through their day-to-day lives in a way that is, you know, for each of them largely unfulfilling. So there is a kind of a sort of metaphorical import. At the same time, though, we do have these murders or attempted murders in some cases, and these don't appear to be, there's very, very little, if anything, that cues these in as being in any way sort of the exterior expressions of internal malaise, a kind of quasi-expressionistic horror. There is an intriguing scene, a very disquieting scene, where a character completely disassociated from Matsuoka, other than being in his class, appears to see the ghost of the girl that Matsuoka-san murdered, which again suggests that either there is a horror that is somehow transmitting itself from person to person, like some kind of a disease or a, you know, a bug or something, or that there is a general sense of how everyone is seeing things, imagining things, encountering figments of their imagination, and perhaps this is something that kind of relates to their individual lives, livelihoods, relationships, what have you. Typically, I mean, even in a feature-length film, I wouldn't expect Kurosawa to provide clear-cut answers to this. I mean, ambiguity, creeping malaise and unease, rather than obviousness or explanation. These are always watchwords with Kurosawa. But the fact that this is only, you know, half the length of a feature film, I think suggests that it has been pared to the bone, and we are seeing things that really there is no obvious explanation for, other than how we each interpret what we see. And that is obviously something that varies from person to person. So this is a film especially that is about us. I've said this with Kurosawa before, that his films ultimately are our films. He makes films that engage us in a way that ask quite a lot of us, that make us aware of kind of existing in this limbo or this liminal space between being caught up in the text and being distanced from it. And there is a tension, and Kurosawa sort of teases us to find it dramatic, involving, even funny. I mean, there are a lot of Kurosawa films that one could easily pitch as black comedies. But that's about us, not about Kurosawa. He lays out these sort of disturbing puzzles, if you like, and it's up to us to put them together however we will. And so they become about us. These are about confronting what we think is happening, and perhaps, you know, what this means and how we can relate to it in various ways. So, with all that being said, it would probably be remiss of me not to sort of explain a little about where the cards fall as far as my understanding or reading of this film goes. And to my mind, Kurosawa's films are never about what they're about. That is, there is always text and subtext, and to me, the surface level of his films is merely a sort of platform to facilitate much deeper concerns, and there's often a chasm, if you like, between the two. So I personally see this film as being all about domesticity, all about the tensions inherent in domesticity, and the violence that kind of lies at the heart of it. Not perhaps one that erupts literally, but that sort of niggling sense that many people's lives, maybe most people's lives, are in some ways unfulfilled, unfulfilling, and they are kind of going through the motions, and resentments, frustrations, recriminations can build up. You know, you can blame those around you. You could blame your partner or your child, you know, for the failures of your own life. They may in turn turn to thoughts of how incapable or unsatisfying sort of father or husband the ostensible head of the household is, and again sort of retreat into themselves, if you like. There really is no explanation, as I've said, particularly for the wife's kind of obsessive recycling. This may be something that people would lean towards in a kind of an environmental sense, but that feels very pat and obvious to me, and beneath Kurosawa, frankly. One thing that's interesting about that is the extent to which the time frame of the film is complicated, I think, by the wife's actions. I mean, it on the surface, it seems like the narrative covers quite a small measure of time, you know, maybe a few days, a week, maybe. But every time we see the wife, she is emptying huge sort of bin bags, or garbage bags if you're watching from across the pond. Hello, American viewers. These are full. It looks like weeks and weeks of collected recycling. Again, I don't think it's any sort of commentary on like alcohol consumption or anything, because there's really nothing at all in the film to suggest that this is kind of meditating, if that's the right way of putting it, on alcoholism. But it seems like there's a disconnect or a discrepancy between the how long it takes for the events to unfold, and this sense that the wife is seems to be taking care of recycling that has been weeks and weeks and weeks sort of collecting. And we see her doing this at least twice in the film with these very significant amounts of recycling, which seems to me to bespeak a time frame that is, you know, quite a bit more than a week. And I'm kind of plucking that length of time out of thin air. There's no obvious designation in the film. It doesn't tell you over how long the events take place, but it just feels like we are looking at successive days. And you know, there are only sort of, well, I don't know, 5 or 6 key scenes that are quite detailed and protracted. So it doesn't feel like it's taking place over that long, but yet we've got this apparent build-up of recycling that the wife has to engage with. So maybe it's meant to bespeak something of her, I I don't know, her mental state, that she's been hoarding all this recycling, all these cans, that somehow she's poured all her attention into that and has become kind of mentally unbalanced. Again, Kurosawa offers us very little, if anything, as a key here to sort of decoding this. And, you know, again, that's very typical of him. And speaking personally, nor would I want him to. One of the things that I love about his films is that that freedom, if you like, to sort of read the films as you see fit, not to have answers, you know, foisted upon you, because that's invariably dissatisfying. And this ambiguity is always key to how sort of unsettling Kurosawa's films are. They're all about the ways in which the real world, sort of quote unquote real life, becomes sort of thrown out of kilter just by kind of niggling small things that we can't identify. You know, a noise we hear, something that we see briefly somewhere, something that we read, something that we encounter for a split second, that sort of festers. And real life, or the surface fabric of reality, sort of, as soon as there's any seed of doubt that is kind of represented by this mysterious ambiguity, that reality very quickly starts to unravel, and anything seems possible. You know, aliens in Before We Vanish, you know, ghosts emerging from the internet in Pulse. Take your pick from Kurosawa's films as to how this sort of unwinding of what we take to be reality and our experience thereof is, you know, progressively, subtly chipped away at and undermined. And, you know, Chime does that as effectively as any Kurosawa film. So, well worth a watch. If you've watched it, if you plan to watch it, let me know. If you watched it and you have a take on the film that differs to mine, then I'd be very, very interested to hear from you. You know, I think we can endlessly chew over and discuss Kurosawa's films. As I said, there are as many readings of most of his films as there are people to read them. So do with this, I'm especially eager to have comments. So let me know what you think, if you've seen it, or when you've seen it. Drop me a line, let me know. There are one or two reviews that you can find, and they will, you know, point up different aspects of the film. But if you like to be unsettled, if you like to be kept in a sort of perennial state of unease and sort of teased about what's happening and why, and let's face it, if you don't, you probably wouldn't get along with Kurosawa's film, so I'm guessing that you do, then, you know, you'll find plenty in this film. Okay, so please do drop me a comment. If you feel like subscribing, then do. If not, fine, don't bother, who cares. Stay tuned for more videos to come, more reviews, analyses about all aspects of Japanese culture. Thanks very much for watching and giving me a little bit of your time, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye for now.